Jesus says to his disciples, "If anyone would like to follow me, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." This passage alone should get people flocking to churches and becoming Christians, don't you think? This is another one of those difficult sayings by Jesus. We'd rather hear passages like, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Or from John, "Until now you have asked nothing in my name. Ask and you will receive, that your joy may be full." Or even from the Beatitudes, "Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted." Those are great feel-good passages that make Christianity comfortable, safe, a buffer against the harsh realities of life. But deny yourself and take up your cross? Many movies that depict Christ doing just that aren't great recruiting methods for Christianity. Who needs that when it's hard enough just to keep the bills paid and food on the table? When it's hard enough just to get up in the morning and face the challenges of the day? Certainly, Jesus didn't mean that the only way we can follow him is through suffering and pain, or that we must be crucified like him on a cross in order to follow him. But if he didn't mean that, what exactly then did he mean? Well, the whole conversation started because Peter was asking those same questions. The disciples were off by themselves with Jesus, taking a breather between the crowds and the critics. In the passage just before this one, which we read last week, Jesus asked his disciples who others thought he really was. And then he asked them who they thought he was. Peter gave the right answer. "You are the Christ," he said, "the Son of the living God." And Jesus rewarded Peter by calling him the Petros, or the pebble, the stone, incorrectly interpreted in English as the rock, but the foundation upon which he would build his church. But Peter's glory doesn't last very long, because as soon as Jesus begins to tell his disciples what is about to be required of him, how he is about to walk right into the trap set for him to Jerusalem, where he will suffer, be killed, and be raised from the dead, Peter explodes. "God forbid it, Lord! This will never happen to you." For Peter, this kind of talk is simply too much. To imagine his wise young teacher coming to such a quick and bloody end, especially an end that can be avoided. In Peter's way of thinking, why walk into a trap when you can turn around and just walk away? Why take a risk that you don't have to take? I think that's a pretty normal and rational way of looking at it. If you know what's coming, and what's coming is bad, wouldn't you do anything you could to avoid it? The newspaper occasionally runs stories about these kinds of risk takers. The man who rushes into the burning building to see if anyone has been left inside. The woman who dives into the hole in the frozen lake to rescue a child who has fallen through. Those, of course, are the dramatic stories, but there are quiet ones too. The doctor who spends several nights a week in a rundown part of town, giving free medical care to homeless men. The student who spends Saturday afternoons rocking orphaned babies with fetal alcohol syndrome, or crack babies in a downtown New York clinic. The teacher who quits her job and spends all of her life savings to go teach in Nicaragua to the peasants how to read. It is only human to admire such people, but there is an equally human part of us that is taken aback by them and is afraid for them. We listen to the dangerous things that they do or are planning to do, and part of us, like Peter, wants to protest. You know, you could get hurt doing that. You could get killed being in that place. You could catch some disease, be shot at, raped, or murdered. God forbid it, comes a voice from deep down inside of us, somewhere. Isn't there an easier way to do what you want to do? Do you have to take such risks? What if you get hurt? What if you get killed? God forbid that something like that should happen to you. That is, in so many words, exactly what Peter says to Jesus. And right or wrong, he has a way of saying what the rest of the disciples and us are thinking. Over and over again, he is the disciples' spokesperson, the one who says the things that they don't dare ask or say. God forbid it, he says, when Jesus predicts his own death, and Jesus explodes. Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. What a shock that must have been for the other disciples. To hear Peter, the first primary disciple, called Satan by Christ. To hear Peter, the foundation of the new church, called a stumbling block or a hindrance in Jesus' way. What did he say wrong? All he did was protest the forecast that Jesus himself said, that he would suffer and die. All he did was say out loud that there had to be another way. As far as Jesus was concerned, though, it was Satan talking. Satan, the ancient tempter. From the beginning of time, the tempter has offered humanity alternatives to the will of God, easier alternatives, safer alternatives, flashier alternatives. All of them temptations for us to do and be something other than what God has called us to do and be. In the case at hand, the temptation for Jesus is to play things safe, to skip the trip to Jerusalem and find another way to save the world, to direct the effort from a secret headquarters maybe, to elude his enemies, staying just out of their reach and leading his holy revolution without placing himself at risk. We must assume that what Peter offers is a real temptation for Christ, because later, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he even prayed to God for this cup to be taken from him. So he really was tempted, and that's why he silences Peter so harshly. Like the tempter in the wilderness, Peter is offering him a way out, a detour around Jerusalem with all of its risk of pain and death, and for a moment, perhaps, that possible alternative seems very attractive to Christ. Get behind me, Satan, he says, however tempted he may be. Here's what troubles me about this exchange between Peter and Christ. Does Jesus mean that all of us who pray to be delivered from suffering, pain, and death are not on the side of God? Does he mean that the only way we can be on God's side is if we are willing, and not only willing, but enthusiastic about enduring suffering and pain? That kind of bothers me. Because I want to believe that God gives us life in abundance, with joy. Not that God is eager to take that joy away. Doesn't God want us to be happy? Doesn't God care about our comfort and safety? Well, the resounding answer, according to this morning's passage, today's passage, is no. If you don't deny yourself and take up your cross, then you can't be a follower of Christ. But the deep secret of Jesus' harsh words for us in this passage is that our fear of suffering and death robs us of the very abundant life Christ offers elsewhere in Scripture. Because our fear of death always turns into fear of living. It turns into a stingy, cautious way of living that is not really living at all. The deep secret of Jesus' harsh words is that the way to have an abundant life is not to save it, but to spend it, to give it away. Winston Churchill once said, "We make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give." Life, real living, cannot be shut up and saved. In order for life to come to fruition and be abundant, it has to be spilled. It has to be wasted. It has to be given away. Each day must pass. Each hour must be devoured. Each moment must be consumed. It is in the fullness of that experience that we have life. Peter wanted to prevent Jesus from doing that. He did not want Jesus' life to be spilled, to be wasted. He wanted to save it, to preserve it, to find a safer, more comfortable way for Jesus to be Lord. What he forgot, apparently, was that Jesus' supply of life was never-ending, that what poured out of him poured out of an underground source so fine, so strong, that the more of himself he gave, the more he had. A veritable geyser of living water sent to drench a dry, parched world. Peter missed that part of what Jesus said, but so do I sometimes. Listen again to what Matthew says. Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And on the third day be raised. Peter missed that part, and so can we. But when we first hear the suffering part and the killing part, our minds don't get that far in what it all means. We get stuck on the suffering and death part. We get that far and say, God forbid it, this shall never happen to you, without finishing the sentence, without noticing that after the suffering and death part, there is life again, abundant life, life for Jesus and life for all of us that can never be cut off. Living the life of faith is not about being a daredevil, however. This is not a sermon about signing up for skydiving lessons or doing dangerous things just for the thrill of it. This is a sermon about living a life that matters, a life for Christ's sake, and about refusing to put our own comfort and safety ahead of living a life like that, a life that pours itself out for others. If anyone would come after me, Jesus says, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Those words will never be easy to hear, but they are not, in the final analysis, an invitation to follow Jesus into death, but instead an invitation to follow him into an abundant, full life. There is a certain amount of pain involved in being human, and a good bit more involved in being fully human, fully alive, especially in a world that counts on our fear of death and uses it to keep us in line. Jesus' enemies counted on his fear of death to shut him up and shut him down, but they were wrong. He may have been afraid, but he did not let his fear stop him. He did not get stuck on the suffering and death part. He saw something beyond that, something as wide and glittering as the sea, worth every risk required to reach it. And he did not stop until he got there. To follow Christ means going beyond the limits of our own comfort and safety. It means receiving our lives as gifts instead of guarding them as our own possessions. It means sharing the life that we have been given instead of bottling it up for our own consumption. It means giving up the notion that we can build dams to contain the bright streams of our lives and letting them go instead. Letting them swell their banks and spill their wealth until they carry us down to where they run, full and growing fuller, into that wide and glittering sea of God. Thanks be to God. Amen.